At some point, something shifted. You stopped texting twice. You stopped showing up where you weren't invited. You stopped performing for people who couldn't be bothered to show up consistently. And from the outside, that probably looked like coldness, like pride maybe. Like you just didn't care enough. But that's not what it was. And somewhere underneath the simplistic reading of it, you already know that, because people who don't chase aren't people who feel less. They're usually people who felt too much for too long in the wrong direction. And at some point, their psychology reorganized itself around a truth that most people spend decades avoiding: that your presence is either wanted or it isn't, and no amount of chasing changes which one is true. This video is about what actually creates that psychology, the real mechanism behind it. Because it's not detachment, it's not ego, and it's not something that arrived from nowhere. Let's start with what the research actually says, because there's a measurable foundation here. Psychologists who study attachment theory, the framework that maps how early relational experiences shape adult behavior, describe a pattern called earned security. It's distinct from the secure attachment that some people develop naturally in stable, consistent early environments. Earned security is what develops when someone has moved through relational disappointment, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability, and has consciously or unconsciously built a stable relationship with themselves on the other side of it. The key word there is earned. It wasn't given. It was constructed, usually quietly, usually alone, usually after a period of doing the opposite and watching it cost them something real. People with earned security don't stop wanting connection. That's the part that gets misread constantly. They want it as much as anyone, but they've recalibrated what they're willing to do to obtain it because they've already run the experiment. They've chased, they've overextended, they've bent themselves into shapes that didn't fit them in order to be chosen by someone who still didn't choose them. And the data came back, and they updated. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called extinction. It describes what happens when a behavior that was once rewarded stops producing a reward. The behavior gradually disappears, not because the person decided to stop, exactly, but because the brain is efficient. It stops investing resources in patterns that no longer return anything. For people who don't chase, something like this happened in the emotional domain. At some point, the chasing stopped working. The extra effort didn't produce the closeness they were looking for. The repeated reaching out didn't generate the reciprocity they needed. And slowly, the behavior extinguished. Not through willpower, not through a decision they made on a specific afternoon, but through accumulated evidence that the return was never going to come. What grew in the space that left behind was something quieter and considerably more stable, a default orientation toward people that could be described simply as this: I will meet you where you are. I will not go further than where you are. And if the distance between us is always my fault to close, then the distance is the answer. Here's where it gets more specific and more honest. People who don't chase have almost always, at some point, been the person who chased too hard. That's not a coincidence. You don't arrive at that kind of clarity from the outside. You arrive at it from the inside of the thing, from the experience of being the one who cared more, who initiated more, who held the relationship together through sheer effort while the other person simply allowed themselves to be held. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only engine in a relationship. Not just romantic relationships, friendships, family dynamics, professional connections where you're always the one following up, always the one remembering, always the one making sure the thing survives. And at some point, the exhaustion becomes information. The clarity that comes from that kind of tiredness is not bitterness, though it can look like it from outside. It's more like a very clean, very quiet realization that relationships which only exist because of your effort are not actually relationships. They're performances that require a one-person cast. The person who stops chasing has usually just finally believed that. Now, this is the part that doesn't get discussed enough. And it matters. Not chasing is not the same as not caring. The conflation of those two things is where most of the misreading happens. People who don't chase often care with extraordinary depth. They just direct that care toward people and situations that have demonstrated they can hold it. They're not withholding themselves. They're being selective about where they spend something they know has value. research on what psychologists call self concept clarity, the degree to which a person has a stable, consistent internal sense of who they are, shows that people with higher self concept clarity are significantly less likely to engage in approval seeking behavior. Not because they're arrogant, but because their self perception isn't contingent on external validation in the same way. They don't need you to confirm them, so they don't perform for confirmation. That's an important distinction, because what looks like indifference from the outside is often just a person who has their own internal ground to stand on. They're not cold, they're rooted. There's also this specific thing that happens in the dynamic between a person who doesn't chase and someone who's used to being chased. The person who's used to being pursued will often, initially, read the lack of pursuit as a problem to solve, as a challenge. The absence of chasing from someone who clearly could chase feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things tend to register as interesting. But the person who doesn't chase isn't playing a strategy. They're not withholding pursuit to manufacture interest. They're simply responding to reality as it presents itself. If you're here, they're glad you're here. If you pull back, they're not going after you, not because they don't want you, but because their internal architecture no longer supports the motion of running towards someone who is walking away. That architecture was built over time, through real experience, and it is not something that dissolves because someone eventually becomes interested. It's a fundamental reorientation toward what relationships are supposed to feel like: mutual, balanced, not a weight that one person carries while the other decides whether to show up. Here's something worth sitting with. The people who don't chase are not people who gave up on connection. They're people who changed their definition of it. They stopped counting as connection anything that required them to convince someone of their worth. They stopped calling it a relationship when the relationship only moved because they pushed it. That sounds simple. It is one of the hardest things a person can actually do, because the instinct to pursue, to close the distance, to make things okay, is deeply human. It's wired in. The neuroscience of social rejection shows that being excluded or ignored activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain registers social withdrawal as a genuine threat. The impulse to chase is not weakness, it is biology. Which means the person who has genuinely stopped chasing has done something quietly remarkable. They have learned to sit with that discomfort without letting it drive behavior. They've learned to feel the pull toward pursuing and to stay still anyway, not because they don't feel it, but because they've felt it enough times to know where it leads. There's one thing that people who don't chase will almost never say out loud, but it's present underneath most of what they do. They're not unavailable. They're just not auditioning. They are fully capable of depth, of loyalty, of showing up completely for the people who show up for them. They are, in many cases, among the most reliable and present people in a room. But that version of them is not accessible through pressure or persistence or manufactured drama designed to provoke a reaction. It's accessible through consistency, through being someone who doesn't make them feel like they have to earn their own place in the dynamic. Give them that, and you'll find out quickly that what you mistook for distance was just discernment. That what looked like not caring was actually a very high standard for what caring is supposed to look like, built from the personal experience of knowing exactly what it feels like when it's missing. And if you watch this and felt recognized, not in the abstract way, but in the specific quiet way that happens when something names a thing you've been carrying without a word for it, then you already understand what it cost to get here, and you already know it was worth it.